All right, so last night we officially had the New Hampshire primaries for both the Democratic and Republican parties. Now, I'm going to start off here with the Republicans, right? And I have a lot to say about the Democratic primary in New Hampshire, which was absolutely insane for a number of different reasons. But just to start off with the Republicans here, right? I'm not going to give you guys too much of a preliminary commentary, but it pretty much went as I think most people expected it to go. If anything, I think that Nikki Haley maybe overperformed slightly. I think in my last video where I was giving my somewhat projections or predictions, I said that in the best possible case scenario that Nikki Haley may come within 6 to 8 percentage points of Donald Trump. It ended up being about 11 percentage points, 139,000 votes to 174,000 votes. I'm pretty sure that the overall participation in this Republican primary was a historical record, so take with that what you will, but Donald Trump won the state of New Hampshire after winning the state of Iowa, where Nikki Haley came in third place, obviously, and then Ron DeSantis, dropped out of the race, endorsed Donald Trump, and then you end up with this, relatively close result here. But then the inevitable question there is like, okay, is this Nikki Haley gaining some crazy momentum, or is this just sort of like a last grasp before we end up inevitably nominating, not we, but Republicans end up inevitably nominating Donald Trump? And I think that the answer to that is pretty clear. New Hampshire is a weird state where frequently they like to bend away from the norm, and so I think that that in combination with the fact that this was somewhat of an open primary where you had a lot of Democrats and independents who were participating in this Republican primary, that sort of inflated Nikki Haley's numbers here. I think it's basically inevitable at this point that Donald Trump, unless he dies from some sort of like an Adderall induced like snorting coma or something like that, or he ends up dying or removing himself from the race due to criminal prosecutions or something else, that he's going to be the nominee. Nikki Haley, I don't know if she's going to stay in the race. I think it would be pretty embarrassing for her, given that one of the next races is going to be in her home state of South Carolina. It would be pretty embarrassing to get absolutely wiped by Donald Trump in your own home state, which is exactly what the polls are saying is going to happen. So I don't know how much longer, and the votes are ticking up here, but I don't know how much longer she's going to stay in this race. But at this point, it's pretty much a wrap. He won New Hampshire, he won Iowa, he's on track to win the next remaining states that are majorly significant states in this primary contest. So I think it's pretty much over. I mean, I guess it's kind of interesting if you look at some of the exit poll data. So here is pointed out by David Wright, CNN's exit poll data. Among Trump voters, you had registered Republican, 70%, registered undeclared, 27%, and unregistered before today, 3%. And among Haley voters, you had registered undeclared, 70%. So, okay, registered Republican, 27%, registered. Okay, so basically what I take from this data is that you had a lot of people who were either independents or Democrats or who were completely unregistered who decided to show up to vote for Nikki Haley as purely an anti-Trump vote in this Republican primary. So again, maybe that has some sort of an implication in the general election, showing an inclination from independent voters or, so-called centrist voters or whatever, that they would be less inclined to vote for Donald Trump in a general election. But other than that, I mean, it basically, again, shows to me that the Republican primary in and of itself in an isolated way is very much a wrap here, and that Nikki Haley's numbers were inflated by some of those other calculations there. We also had some interviews that were done. This one was pretty funny here by CNN, where a voter just straight up admits, like, yeah, I showed up to vote for this, in this primary because I wanted to vote against Trump, and even if my preferred candidate, Nikki Haley, were to run against Joe Biden and win the Republican primary, I would still vote for Joe Biden. So let's go ahead and watch a little bit of this clip.
Nikki Haley.
And why did you vote for Nikki Haley?
It's a vote against Trump. I think it would be better to have her against Biden in the elections than it would be Trump and her.
Do you consider yourself generally independent, Republican, or Democrat?
Democrat.
So when you undeclared, you voted for Nikki Haley. If it was Nikki Haley against Joe Biden in a general election, who are you voting for?
Joe Biden.
What is
Okay, so I don't know how many people this kind of guy represents, but again, it kind of gives you an inclination, right? For the rest of this Republican primary, it's going to be Donald Trump dominated, okay? I hate the man. I disagree with almost the entirety of his policy agenda, but that's just what Republican voters want. And, we've seen guys like Vivek who have come in and dropped out, and Tim Scott come in and dropped out, and DeSantis come in and dropped out. Nikki Haley is the only remaining major challenger to Donald Trump, and I see no path forward for her to actually win this primary. And so at this point, when you have guys like this who are self-declared Democrats who say, even if the person I just voted for, Nikki Haley, were to run against Joe Biden, I'm still going to vote for Joe Biden. Well, how much can you possibly take this, somewhat close result here in New Hampshire as actual, evidence of some sort of a Nikki Haley surge here? But with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into some of the clips that we got in their speeches afterwards, right? So let's go ahead and listen to Nikki Haley here for a second.
I want to congratulate Donald Trump on his victory tonight. He earned it, and I want to acknowledge that. Now, you've all heard the chatter among the political class. They're falling all over themselves, saying this race is over. Well, I have news for all of them. New Hampshire is first in the nation. It is not the last in the nation.
Okay. I mean, it's definitely some copium going on here. Yeah, I mean, it's not first in the nation. It's also not last in the nation. I mean, I don't know why she said that. She said New Hampshire is first in the nation. It's not last. It wasn't first in the nation. It was second. You just had the Iowa primaries in which you came in third place and then came out and, definitively declared that it was a two-person race from there, even though you came in third place. But it's not the first in the nation. It's obviously also not the last in the nation. But the rest of the states that are on the ballot right now, it's not looking too good for you in the Republican primaries. So again, a little bit of copium there, a little bit confusing as to why she would use that line, but it looks like Nikki Haley is going to stay in this race, which is kind of interesting. Again, maybe she's betting on Donald Trump being like sort of removed in one way or another from the contest, and then she's the next person up and she can take up that mantle. I don't really know if she actually believes that she has a path forward to victory, but let's listen to this second side here, where she actually makes a point that I somewhat agree with here.
With Donald Trump, Republicans have lost almost every competitive election. We lost the Senate. We lost the House. We lost the White House. We lost in 2018, we lost in 2020, and we lost in 2022. The worst kept secret in politics is how badly the Democrats want to run against Donald Trump. They...
Okay, so I mean, objectively, she's kind of right. I mean, Trump won in 2016. There was a so-called blue wave in 2018. Biden won in 2020. Granted, that was a close election if you look at the swing state totals. And then in 2022, Republicans were supposed to have this massive red wave. And then, they barely won the House. Right now, it's almost an even split. In the Senate, Democrats held on there. So, I mean, yeah, Trump is kind of a loser, especially, when you contrast his 2016 campaign, where he was running against, I'm against the political establishment. Let's drain the swamp. Let's build the wall. Let's get rid of these corrupt corporate elites who have been ruining your lives for decades and decades, right? Hillary Clinton, she's an embodiment of the establishment. I mean, that was like a perfect moment for Trump to use that kind of rhetoric in an effective way to win the presidency. He didn't follow through on any of it, but to use that rhetoric. Then if you fast forward to like 2018, 2020, especially 2020, all he's focusing on is like, all of this bullshit, either culture war stuff or even post 2020, he's focusing on how the election was stolen from me and he can't shut the fuck up about that. And, all of these issues that are not core material issues that platformed him in the 2016 election and allowed him to become the sort of caricature in American politics that he inevitably became. And so, yeah, I mean, his whole appeal kind of fell off in a little bit, right? Oh, I'm supposed to be this political outsider. I'm not the elite. I'm not the swamp. And then, when you nominate guys like Steve Mnuchin to run your, Treasury Department, a guy who came from Goldman Sachs who helped tank the 2008 economy, when you nominate guys like John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, the rest of these motherfuckers, it becomes pretty clear. When your main, achievement under your presidency is a massive corporate and billionaire tax cut, it becomes pretty clear that you're not actually serving average working class people. You're serving the elites. You are as swampy as swampiness can possibly get. And so when you're focused on petty personal issues and vendettas, that's not going to be really an effective campaign strategy. And so we did see in 2022, Trump candidates, Stop the Steal candidates, sort of get wiped off the face of the map. And so she's not necessarily wrong here. Whether or not she would do better than Donald Trump is kind of still a question mark. I think, honestly, Nikki Haley probably would have a better chance against Joe Biden than Donald Trump, given all of his baggage. But again, the core point here is that you don't have a chance in the Republican primary. You just don't. And that's the reality. And so we get to Trump's statements here as well. Let's go ahead and listen to a little bit of Trump with Tim Scott here. Just very, very sad, pathetic man here with Tim Scott. He recently got married, apparently. I'm not going to talk about that, the specifics surrounding him getting some sort of an impromptu wedding recently with all the allegations surrounding him. But, he's standing behind Trump, endorsing him. DeSantis endorsed him recently. Vivek, I think, is somewhere here in the background. And, with all of these guys surrounding him, recognizing the moment, recognizing Trump's going to be the guy, they're all trying to save their political ass and jumping behind him. And so let's go ahead and listen to a little bit of what Trump had to say about Nikki.
She ran up when it was 7. And, we have to do what's good for our party. And she was up, and I said, wow, she's doing like a speech like she won. She didn't win, she lost. And, last week we had a little bit of a problem. And if you remember, Ron was very upset because she ran up and she pretended she won Iowa. And I looked around, I said, didn't she come in 3rd? Yeah, she came in 3rd. And then I looked at the polls. She was talking about most winnability, who's going to win, and I had one put up. I don't know if you see it, but I have one put up. We've won almost every single poll in the last 3 months against crooked Joe Biden, almost every poll. And she doesn't win those polls. And she doesn't win those. This is not your typical victory speech, but let's not have somebody take a victory when she had a very bad night. She had a very bad night. And you have the now very unpopular governor of this state. This guy, he's got to be on.
Okay, so you can hear some of his supporters yelling out "bird brain, Nikki Haley." Okay, I'm not mad at it. It is what it is. In terms of the polling data that he just brought up there, every poll that I've seen, and maybe I'm out of touch here, but I've seen a lot of polls on this. As far as I know, either generic Republican or Nikki Haley versus Joe Biden does better than Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. Now, Joe Biden is like a historically weak candidate going into 2024. And when I say historically, that's not hyperbole. That's not me pulling that out of my ass. I'm talking about actual historical comparisons of presidents throughout recent modern history running for re-election. And you can even go all the way back to like Jimmy Carter, and Joe Biden is in a worse position than he was at the time. Worse position than Lyndon B. Johnson was at the time. Like, Joe Biden is a historically weak re-election candidate. And Donald Trump is still, I think, edging him out a little bit in a lot of the national polls. Whether or not that makes a significant difference in each individual state poll of swing states. We talked about that, where there are some polls showing Trump up significantly in some of these swing states. But the point being that it's a pretty close split right now, given how weak both of the candidates are between Trump and Biden. But when you insert a random generic Republican against Joe Biden, including somebody like Nikki Haley specifically against Joe Biden, she does significantly better, at least as far as I've seen. So it's kind of confusing that he's saying, like, I'm up in these polls and Nikki Haley would not be up in these polls. I think that's just objectively not true. But if you guys have seen anything different, correct me if I'm wrong. But, obviously I'm no fan of Nikki Haley, but I think she would probably be in the same vein as, DeSantis would probably be, or any random, standard Republican would probably be a stronger candidate against Joe Biden, given his weaknesses, than Donald Trump, who has, multiple indictments and 91 criminal charges and the history of January 6th and trying to steal the election and all of his chaotic bullshit that people are fed up with. I think a standard Republican would probably have a better chance against Joe Biden, but we're going to finish off here where he makes a similar point to what we were just talking about earlier with some extracurricular activity in participating in this Republican primary.
The other thing, she only got 25% of the Republican votes. I don't know if you...
Okay, so I don't know if she actually got 25% of the like registered Republican vote. I don't know if he's correct about that. Honestly, it wouldn't surprise me if that's true. Anyways, the results are what they are. You know, take with them what you will. 54% to 43%. I think it was significantly elevated because you had a lot of guys like this guy who were Democrats or independents who would have no intention of voting for a Republican in the general election, who came out to vote against Donald Trump. I don't know how much of an impact that had, but you know, at this point, it doesn't even really fucking matter to me. Because even though Nikki Haley's numbers were inflated and she did better than a lot of people thought that she was going to do, this primary is a wrap. It's done. I mean, at this point, it's just how long is Nikki Haley going to last? Is Donald Trump going to survive to the next, you know, to the general election? Is Joe Biden going to survive to the general election? These are, honestly, that's a more important question to me in terms of the outcome of 2024 than whether or not Nikki Haley is going to have some sort of a surge and defeat Donald Trump outright. That to me is like a 0% chance, but I would put it at maybe like a 10% chance, 20% chance that either Joe Biden or Donald Trump end up dying before the next election. So, you know, I think there's more important conversations to be had about, you know, what the inevitable outcome is going to be. And so now we move on to the Democratic primary. So obviously, you know, not unexpected here, but Joe Biden won in New Hampshire, right? So he got, as far as this current tabulation here, 95% of the votes in, 55.7% to Dean Phillips, 19.6%, to unprocessed write-ins, which I'll circle back around to that here in a second, other write-ins, which again I'll circle back around to, and then Marianne Williamson at about 4.6%. So, listen, there's a couple of different things to say here. First off, I think these unprocessed write-ins, significant amount of that could go to Joe Biden. Some amount of that could go to Cenk Uygur. He might have had some sort of write-in campaign. There was also a campaign that I mentioned previously on this channel for people to write in the words ceasefire as a protest against Joe Biden. So some of these unprocessed write-ins may be ceasefire, they may be Joe Biden, they may be Cenk Uygur, they may be somebody else, and as well as the other write-ins. I don't think that can be Joe Biden because I think they're saying that's anybody other than Joe Biden or Dean Phillips or Marianne Williamson. So this number of other write-ins, 7,000 some odd, may be ceasefire, it may be Cenk, it may be some other person. So this is kind of like a lot of this data we don't necessarily have a final tabulation on. But, you know, the overall context of this I think is important to talk about, because what Joe Biden did, what the Democratic Party did in New Hampshire is so undemocratic and authoritarian that it's like laughable that they are now trying to run the 2024 campaign on we are the vanguard standing up against Trump's and the Republican Party's threat to democracy in the United States, which as a, you know, as somebody who's objective, as somebody who is a leftist who recognizes the actual real authoritarian threat of somebody like Donald Trump, of the Republican Party broadly, even though I agree with that critique of them, to then turn around and to try to rig your own primary, I mean, it kind of rings hollow. And so what I mean by that is that New Hampshire, in their state constitution, okay, and keep in mind, New Hampshire is controlled by Republicans in their state legislature, so they couldn't even change this if they wanted to. But in their state constitution, they have it written that they are going to be the first in the nation. They are the first to vote in the primary contest, right? And so that's a part of New Hampshire politics. It has been for a while. And so what Joe Biden did, along with the DNC, is they tried to shift the Democratic primary schedule to have states like South Carolina, for example, go earlier in the schedule, to go first in the schedule. And the reason for that is pretty transparent, right? If you circle back around to 2020, the reason that happened is because that was the state that basically flipped, you know, the race from Bernie momentum to Joe Biden momentum, right? And the media had a whole circus around that and all of that. And you had the, you know, James Clyburn endorsement of Joe Biden, and he won in South Carolina. And it was like, oh, now it's not Bernie's race, even though he won the first 3 primaries. Now it's Joe Biden's race. So they flipped the schedule to try to benefit Joe Biden as much as they possibly could. And New Hampshire Democrats turned around and they said, well, hold on a second. We don't even control the state legislature, number one. Number two, it's in our constitution that we have to go first in the you know, schedule. And so we can't just change around our schedule to try to help to rig the primary in favor of Joe Biden. And so then you had this entire complicated process play out where Democrats were like, well, Joe Biden's not going to, you know, appear on the ballot here in New Hampshire. And they had to do this like convoluted write-in campaign to get Joe Biden. And so, you know, basically this was a lot of write-in votes for Joe Biden in New Hampshire. And so Dean Phillips was the only major Democrat, along with Marianne Williamson, who has actually had their name on the ballot for people to see. And so maybe there was a dip in Joe Biden's support. Maybe there was an increase in Dean Phillips' support, for example, with his name being, primary on the ballot, that detracted in some way from Joe Biden. It's hard to say. Either way, I think it's insulting to everybody in the state of New Hampshire that the Democratic Party tried to pull this and tried to give you a double slap to the face to, disregard your constitution, disregard the political realities of the state of New Hampshire, and try to rig the primary more so in favor of Joe Biden. And then to turn around and the Democratic Party, quite literally said, we're not even going to count the New Hampshire primary because they refused to change their schedule in favor of Joe Biden. And so they're basically, they were like, this primary doesn't really count. But anyways, Joe Biden ended up winning, obviously, with 56, roughly percentage of the votes. Dean Phillips, this is roughly in line with what I think most people expected him to get. I was honestly, in some sense, hoping that he would do better than this so that there would be more of a narrative challenge to Joe Biden in the primary. And then you have Marianne Williamson down here at 4.6%. I mean, there's basically been a complete blackout of Marianne Williamson. And I did think it was, although I understand the underlying message of writing in ceasefire as a protest to Joe Biden, I would prefer those votes go to Marianne Williamson to increase her percentage point in the state of New Hampshire. I don't know what the future of her campaign is. I don't know what the future of Dean Phillips' campaign is. He's better on, certain issues than Joe Biden. He's worse or equal to Joe Biden on certain issues like Israel, for example. But, this also was not a terribly, unexpected result to this primary campaign, which is really unfortunate because in all of these liberal media outlets, MSNBC, CNN, whatever the case may be, for the entirety of this primary, they've just been acting like there is no challenge to Joe Biden. He's been anointed. He is the guy who is going to be the Democratic nominee in 2024. Even as we've gotten polling data that has shown definitively over and over and over again that not just a majority of Americans, but even a majority of Democrats don't want Joe to be their nominee in 2024. They want somebody new. And this is something that he even promised way back in the day in 2020, basically giving the inclination that, I'm going to be a transitory president, right? I'm going to be the guy who stops the MAGA movement and then I hand it off to a new generation of Democrats. And I don't know if it's his age. I don't know if it's because he's so senile that he thinks he's a guaranteed lock for 2024, or if it's hubris, if it's his ego, or whatever the case may be, if he doesn't think there's a better challenger out there who could do better than him. But, they have been basically blacking out any challengers to Joe Biden, blacking out the idea that there even is a current primary unfolding. They haven't given a fair share to Marianne. They haven't given a fair share even to Dean Phillips, who, again, I disagree with on many different issues, but they basically just pretending as if this was a wrap from the beginning. And so with that media blackout, with the schedule rigging and all the chaos surrounding that, with the, threats against anybody who would host some sort of a Dean Phillips event or a Marianne Williamson event, with all of these, backhanded, nefarious plots that have been waged by the Democratic Party this election cycle, as well as in 2020, as well as in 2016, it's just so deeply authoritarian. And again, it takes away from any sort of narrative to anybody who's been paying attention that the Democratic Party, we're the big vanguard standing up against authoritarianism or tyrannism or, whatever the case may be, or we're standing up for democracy, when this is how you're handling your own primary contests. So it's been an embarrassment for the DNC. It's been an embarrassment for Joe Biden. It's been an embarrassment for the U.S. media, the liberal media in the U.S. And this is the kind of result that you're going to get from that. So, there's your wrap up of how both of these primaries went. It's honestly deeply depressing that we live in the wealthiest country that has ever existed on the face of the planet, arguably the most powerful country that has ever existed on the face of the planet. And with all of these resources, with all of this wealth, with all of this power, we have Joseph Robinette Biden and Donald John Trump, who are, in all likelihood, inevitably going to be our next nominees for president. What does that say about our country? What does that say about the future of this declining empire? That this is the best we can do. This is the best we can do. Joe Biden and Donald Trump. How fucking sad is that? How depressing is that? I would rather take a dice roll on picking out two random Americans, okay? Pick them out of a hat and have them run against each other to be the next president of the United States, and to have these two corrupt, senile motherfuckers run for re-election. It is the re-election that absolutely no American wants to see again. And yet this is what we are stuck with. Why? Because our political system is so corrupt. is so authoritarian, is so against representing the interests, the wants of average Americans in this country, that there is no other option that is even feasibly put on the table. And it's just an absolute embarrassment.